everyone, and welcome to our next panel. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. So we have a panel on optimizing real-world evidence and real-world data. Our moderator for this particular panel is Rachel Ford-Hutman, founder and CEO of Ford-Hutman Media. Just as a reminder, please do ask questions, put them in the chat. We will get to as many of them as we possibly can, but obviously if you don't ask them, then we're not going to be able to answer them. So without further ado, Rachel, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Becky. Yes, please do ask questions. We really want this to be an engaging panel for everyone today. And thank you all for joining Optimizing Real-World Evidence and Real-World Data. You know, as the COVID-19 outbreak continues to take its toll on global markets, real-world evidence is set to become the most influential emerging technology to help in the fight against the COVID-19 outbreak, as it provides valuable insights to understand better, monitor, and prepare for the challenges caused by the pandemic. You know, expansion of its use, however, really requires coordinated action, across the healthcare value chain. And we are so lucky to have a panel of experts with us today to explore strategies to access and optimize real-world data and really share their thoughts on the impact they will have for healthcare and life sciences. So let's start off with introductions from everyone. Carolyn, if you can please kick us off.
Happy to. Carolyn McGill. I'm the CEO of Aetion. We have a technology that was built for the purpose of transforming real-world data, so healthcare data reflecting our everyday lives, into what we consider to be regulatory-grade real-world evidence. Biopharma manufacturers, payers, regulatory agencies use our platform to assess safety, effectiveness, and value of medications and clinical treatments for specific patient populations. My background is primarily in the payer and at-risk provider space. I spent nearly a decade at United Health Group leading Medicare and Medicaid special needs plans. And then the last decade, I've been in a series of technology companies, Evolent Health, Remedy Partners, and now Aetion, focused on supporting organizations in healthcare and transforming from volume to value, and doing that in a highly informed way with the kind of technology and data to support those decisions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn. Adrian, if you could please provide your introduction next.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. So my name is Adrian Cassidy, and I am the global head for real-world evidence at Novartis. So at Novartis, we focus on using real-world evidence to accelerate development programs through innovative designs, really focus also on how we think about accelerating access to our medicines and broadening that access as well as also thinking about how we optimize medical practice. So happy to be here to contribute to the panel discussion today and share some insights on that. So in terms of background, I spent around 10 years in industry in leadership roles in real-world evidence, and prior to that, around 10 years in academia. So also broadly in the same area. So yeah, happy to be here today and contribute.
Wonderful. It's going to be great to have your global expertise with us. And Lori, my fellow Marylander, if you could please go next.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Lori Evans Bernstein. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you on this panel today. I'm a co-founder and president of Health Reveal. Health Reveal is a clinical AI company focused on chronic disease management, personalized chronic disease management. My background is sort of twofold. One is as an entrepreneur, sort of building and running health tech companies focused in the data and clinical decision support, mostly over the years, and also in the public sector, part of the inaugural team at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT back when it was established in 2004. That makes me feel a little bit old here. And then also had the pleasure of serving as a deputy commissioner of the health department in New York State, leading an Office of Health Transformation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lori. And Mickey, if you could please go next.
Thank you, and great to be here, everyone. I'm Mickey Nash. I'm the co-founder at Evidation Health. And Evidation is a two-sided platform that basically gives agency to individuals to engage with any type of research While on the other side, it really provides pharma the ability to actually engage with these patients and their data. When we're talking about the data, we're talking about everything that a patient generates between care. So not just sort of those sparse touch points when somebody hits the healthcare system, but all of the data that we generate through our daily lives in the digital realm. What this does is it enables a rapid cycle learning engine, and it enables pharma to sort of translate these vast streams of ethically accessed novel data sources into either medical claims or futuristically becoming executables in the virtual healthcare service. So it's a little bit of a new model when we're thinking about this. Novel data is fairly new. We just late 2019 got our very own acronym, which is very meaningful because now PGHD exists, and it's sort of the person-generated health data acronym, which was a proud moment for us after a decade of trying to get this data into the healthcare stream. And my history is really outside of the healthcare realm. I come from a big data background, working in telcos and in finance. And really, when founding this company, we sort of looked at the problem that is healthcare and thought that if we could actually harness this data, we could really revolutionize how care happens, because we actually take the individual into consideration.
Well, I like what you said there about healthcare being a big problem. So we will definitely circle back to that shortly. Vindel, last but certainly not least, sir.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm certainly happy to be here. My name is Vincent Washington. I'm the Chief Executive at Onduo and the Chief Clinical Officer at Verily. Onduo is a Verily company. Verily is the life sciences bet of Alphabet. And our mission is really around providing solutions for population health, where we take novel sensing data, use machine learning and AI to have insights into individuals, and then to use our experience and user experience and design to help people find their path to the right activities, the right thing for patients at the right time. My background, I'm an emergency medicine physician. I've spent most of my career on the provider side of things, but I also spent time as the Chief Medical Information Officer and Chief Information Officer at a health system, and have a connection with Lori in that I served as the National Coordinator for Health IT, actually a little bit after you in the Obama administration, and I'm certainly happy to be here today for the discussion.
Wonderful. Well, great to have you with us, Vindel. And I saw Onduo's expansion news today, so congratulations, and I'm looking forward to picking your brain about that.
Yeah, we're super excited.
So healthcare is often called a 1,000-piece puzzle, and each of us holds a piece of that puzzle. I'm just so thrilled to have a panel of such experts really across the healthcare ecosystem here to try to learn more about what part of the puzzle each of you holds. So I'm going to start off with just a really big question, which is looking at the market. Real world evidence is projected to reach 3.13 billion by 2027. So here is a really, really big question for you guys. How do we get there? And I think, Mickey, maybe if you could kick us off, because I heard you talking about the problem of healthcare, and I think that's where I'd really like to start us off.
Yeah, I would love to kick us off on this one. I think one of the biggest issues that we have in the sort of ever-expanding bubble of cost that is healthcare is there is sort of a real willingness to think about the patient and bring the patient into this. There is an idea on the left-hand side that says we're going to do value-based payments. And sort of everybody has this grand idea of how we're going to fix the problem. But when you think of value-based payments, the moral hazard is the fact that if we don't pay the physician when a patient doesn't actually do what they're supposed to do, then the physician isn't going to keep that patient on. So value breaks down when we're building risk models where not all legs of the stool are there. So I think when you're looking holistically at healthcare, we really have to embrace the fact that all of the component pieces have to be there, and we have to rethink how we put those components together to actually measure outcomes or to actually improve healthcare. And that really means that we have to rethink how we market. So if you think about, when you think of the manufacturers, they're sitting there and they have their customer, which is the healthcare providers, and their consumer, which is the patient, are two different people speaking two different languages. And so the first thing is they either speak one language, leave one or the other out in any of the conversations. On the other side of it, we've got insurers that are making decisions about who gets what when. but they don't engage the patient in the why you have to take this every day. So all of those models have to be slightly repaired so that we can do a better engagement overall and then improve outcomes overall. We can't sort of fix a problem in one corner of the puzzle. I like that idea of the 1,000-piece puzzle, because we'll never get a complete picture if we don't all sort of get together and put the blocks of colors together so that we can properly fix it.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I would love to jump in and build on what Mickey said. We couldn't agree more about things starting and ending with the patient, and we need to be more patient-centric. And the way I think we realize the potential of RWE, as you laid out, over $3 billion in the next 5 or so years, is to ensure that we are transforming data into evidence in a responsible way. So we're working, as an example, at Aetion with FDA, with EMA, with PMDA, global regulators, on understanding when is data fit for purpose of the specific question that we're trying to answer. When do we use claims? When do we turn to Mickey to help us with more novel data sources, as an example? And then what methodology are we applying so that evidence is actually evidence? You know, of course, in the last few months or the last year with COVID, we saw retractions of reports in very respected medical journals because of data studies that weren't done effectively. And so ensuring that we're coming together as an industry around how to transform data into evidence responsibly and consistently and in a transparent way, I think will help to usher in our potential in terms of market size.
Yeah, and if I could jump in as well, I love what Mickey and Carolyn said, and just to add to that, we're very focused on building real world evidence from available established medical guidelines. And the foundation of our clinical AI capability is those computable guidelines. So when we apply real world data to them, we can help drive guideline directed medical therapy as the basis for supporting our providers and so forth. And as we partner with, I think building relationships with industry as key sponsors of real world evidence, and then partnering with providers to really incorporate continuous data monitoring to generate that real world evidence will only help us sort of drive the type of outcomes and compliance with guideline directed medical therapy as we continue to drive more precision into clinical trials, for example, and then drive the sort of affirming or rejecting those study aspects, or addressing unanswered questions around numbers needed to treat, for example, or representing women and minority groups more in trials, for example.
If I can add 2 quick things to Lori's comment. I'm really struck by this idea of how you gather the evidence that we're talking about. And one of the things we focus on is how does the data get from the individual into this sort of analytic engine? How does it go forward? And one of the things we're super focused on and think are that's critical in this space is that no one wants to think about themselves as an experiment or being an experiment. No one wants the extra burden in their daily life of participating in such a thing. And so this idea of having novel sensing devices that collect data in a passive way that are not intrusive, I think is critical. And then the second is, I think we have to realize that people are not necessarily, we're all humans, which means that we're not necessarily logical and move from A to B to C. And so talking to someone about what may happen to them if things don't go well with their chronic disease in 40 years is not nearly as effective as meeting people where they are today. And so I think this sort of person-centered approach, even in this area, real world evidence generation, is critical.
Yeah, I think, just sort of maybe summing up on some of those aspects, one of the big challenges, of course, around real world data is that because it is collected in real world settings, of course, the issue is always around either being of less quality or less robustness than what we would generally see within, for instance, a traditional sort of evidence generation approach around randomized control trials. But I think, building on what Carolyn had said, really, I'd like to focus that we really need this sort of cultural shift in order to realize the potential of real world evidence, in that we need to build a level of trust and reliability and validity in the validity of real world evidence. And not only, building awareness, but really, demonstrating how it can support decision making and how it can support improvements in patient care. I think we need to see these examples shared more broadly amongst stakeholders and also amongst health authorities. And also, I think that, this challenge of always comparing RWE compared to real world or randomized clinical trials as well is probably a little bit outdated. We have to have this acceptance that both are good in their own right and can also be very complementary for a variety of different reasons. So really, this whole element about building, about improving transparency to build trust, for me, will be one of the biggest drivers to the broader use and application of real world evidence in the future.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm so happy to hear a lot of you guys talking about trust and building that transparency and working with the regulators early on, right? So how has COVID changed your business strategies at all? Have things changed? Have things reshuffled for you? And Vindel, this might be a great, opportunity for you to talk about the Onduo expansion today. I'm curious if that happened, was already in the works before COVID.
Yeah, I guess the way we've been thinking about it is we were on a path, and the pressure of COVID and the pandemic, I think, accelerated the activity as opposed to engendered it from scratch. But one of the areas that we've been focused on, it really goes to our last conversation point, which is how do you meet people where they are? And one of the things that we've really doubled down on is that people don't think of themselves as walking around with a chronic disease. They're not labeled on their forehead as a diabetic or labeled on their forehead as a hypertensive. So this idea around this comprehensive care strategy, it's more around the individual's whole person as opposed to some individual aspect, it became something that we doubled down and accelerated on. So for us, focusing on diabetes at the beginning of our company, recognizing that 70% of those diabetics have hypertension and other conditions, and much of that is exacerbated by the mental stress of the pandemic, it became clear in March and April that we needed to sort of increase our efforts around the mental and behavioral health aspects of it and sort of meet people where they were. And so the first thing that accelerated was the whole person-centered care and a focus on mental health and mental well-being, because our patients were crying out for that in that period of isolation and stress. And so that was really critical for us. And then the second component of it was, really we had maybe too narrow a focus on who might need and desire those services. And so if anything, the pandemic taught us that we shouldn't underestimate people's sort of both interest and ability to engage in, for example, tech-based solutions, et cetera. So it's a matter of us sort of configuring ourselves in a way to meet that. So whether it's a language expansion that you need to meet people where they are, whether it's a technology platform so that you maybe don't need to have to go to an app store, that you're doing sort of web-based applications. The penetration of smartphones is pretty high in the country, regardless of the economic base. And so if anything, it said to us that the time is right for that kind of acceleration and expansion. And so we've been doubling down on those aspects of meeting people where they are.
Does anybody else want to add on to business needs changing during COVID?
Well, similar to, just real quick, we doubled down on our strategy. And really what we saw was an acceleration of a recognition that real world evidence should be informing decision-making, especially on behalf of regulators. So when FDA chose to use Aetion's platform to assess safety and effectiveness of COVID treatments, we were able to demonstrate how what we have been doing is applicable when data are available in a more real-time setting, and also data from different sources. So from a provider in Northwestern United States, as an example, in contrast to Southeastern United States, what differences are we seeing? How does that have an impact on the kinds of results that we see relative to a specific patient population. And so that partnership with FDA helped us to also inform standards, inform understanding of where there are limitations in that underlying data, and then how that methodology needs to kind of rise to the occasion, if you will, relative to those high bars of understanding whether it's appropriate to use dexamethasone, and if so, when, because physicians are hanging on these results to make a decision on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think just in general, again, it probably didn't change so much our strategy, at least within a sort of a larger pharmaceutical company, but it did, I guess, generate a lot more awareness about how we could rapidly generate insights on patients who were on our medicines and how they're performing on those. And I think also there's a double-edged sword with that as well, right? Whilst there was this potential to understand the environment really quickly and also use potentially things like machine reading tools to understand the literature that was coming out really quickly as well. A lot of what was coming out actually in the very early months of the pandemic was, of course, also not very reliable because there was no proper diagnostic coding and things like that there. So there were, I think in sort of what I would say in general is that it heightened the understanding of what the opportunities were in this space. But it also heightened, I guess, the realization that, you cannot just, have a very crude approach to dealing with these type of data. You have to understand what lies beneath them as well. So yeah.
Yeah. I think for us, things have shuffled a bit for us. Healthcare providers and manufacturers sustained, massive revenue losses as volumes lagged throughout the pandemic. So we're supporting RWE studies that promote utilization of high-value services to get patients the care they need and help get healthcare organizations back on a good revenue path. In addition to sort of what was more, core mainstream for us, which was proactive outreach, now more and more virtual outreach to provide patients at greatest risk with guideline-directed medical care to minimize COVID's collateral damage.
I think the one thing that we learned in COVID, I think, was the fact that having a large, engaged patient base that is actually digitally connected allows you to have instant access to sentiment, to understand what's going on. And I think for us, as opposed to, we've always had this large group of patients interested in research. And what it meant for COVID was that we could answer questions, whether it was the regulators asking it or our partners asking it, very, very quickly at scale. And I think that rethink is something that we should all sort of embrace, this idea of passive data collection, this idea of really having an ability to engage patients at large, virtually, trust with trust, so that you're not misusing that particular engagement, really does bring us to a point where we can have quasi-real-time access to the types of insights that the market needs to make big decisions on. And I think this pandemic was sort of that realization that when you can do that, and you bring the response levels that we could sort of bring at that scale, it changes how you can approach these things. And that was a big shift for, in general, acceptance of this idea that patients as the arbiters of the ground truth, when you connect with them at scale, is really something that's going to differentiate how we do healthcare in the future.
Agreed. So interesting question from our listeners. You've talked a lot about the opportunities, but there are also lots of concerns from people who are perhaps less informed, more suspicious about this. What can be done to address this, whether real or unfounded? Who wants to take that on?
I can definitely start with that one from a trust perspective. Adrian, you can go ahead.
You go ahead, Mickey.
This is probably one of the most important aspects of any of the real world data that we are touching right now is that the ethical access to that data has to be forefront for every one of us, because at some point, if we continue doing data out of the back door, it's going to get shut down. There is a possibility of patient-mediated access to data. There is a possibility of allowing the patient to be the decision maker about who uses their data and how. And we need to also just start thinking about, when we're building these models, what biases are we building in them if we are using payer data? If we're using claims data, then it's generally the US claims data. It's generally going to have some level of bias to who has access to exceptional healthcare, and that is going to change how we model. So if we're going to say that we're going to look at minorities and we're really going to bring those things in, then we as a community that are doing this data work need to step up and just be very transparent and honest about its shortcomings, and then also start moving towards this sort of ethical access where the patient decides which data are going to be shared and for how long and to whom.
Yeah, I wanted to share just a thought on this. I've spent a fair bit of my career thinking about sort of trying to build trust and the doctor-patient relationship and in other different relationships in healthcare. And in the last maybe decade or 15 years, more of a focus on underserved communities. And the one thing I would say about this as a tenant is there is no switch that gets turned on. And yesterday, I don't trust you, and today you're trustworthy. And in our thought about it, it's really built up of two concepts. One is the concept that Mickey started with, which is really open and transparent activities. And so there can't be secrets that pop up at the last minute, et cetera. But the second one, which I think is also important, is consistency over time. And so I've got to do what I say I'm going to do, and I've got to do that over a portion of time in order to build the trust that's necessary, both to trust in things like the real world evidence we're talking about, but also in just straightforward healthcare ecosystem items of delivering care in communities, particularly communities of need. And so my brown skin is no automatic trust card that I play when I walk into a community that's been underserved. I think it's a charge that we should take as a healthcare ecosystem to be much more transparent than we've been in the past about every aspect of this, including when we're not quite sure of the path forward, and doing that over and over again over time. And I think that's incrementally what builds trust. And I think that's something that's a charge to us at large.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and also sort of building, I would also say it's the component of also responsible use, and this aspect of also understanding when real world data or real world evidence it is fit for purpose and when it is not, and there are sort of clear cut I would say areas where it's clearly not, for instance, or areas where it is more fit for use. And so rather than, think of these as a dichotomy, as a choice, should I do one over the other? I think where we're moving is to also ensure that the elements that we have available to us should be used in the most complementary fashion possible. To ensure that we have this integrated approach on actually generating a sort of comprehensive evidence package. But really, the onus is also on all of us for the responsible use of data as well.
Yeah. Yes, agreed. Yeah. That reminds me of when I worked for IBM Watson Health, and the trust and transparency are so incredibly important. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just gonna, I love everyone's responses and couldn't agree more how important this is. And it's one of the reasons why we've started with this sort of evidence-based foundation in our solution, and driving transparency into clinical decision-making and clinical recommendations that's really explainable, and then being able to support a cycle of transparency where now we could ask a lot more questions of the data, right? Some of which can improve things, right away in practice, day to day. Some of things which will result in more clinical trials, which will then produce more precise guidelines, more personalized guidelines for patients in treatment. And we have this cycle of transparency of how we can explain, right, what the data is telling us. And so we feel really strongly about that, in addition to supporting shared decision-making with patients. And I certainly agree, Vindel, I think there's going to be a massive sort of consumer-directed, interoperability explosion with, putting patients and consumers really in control of where they want their data and how they want it to use. And I think that's going to be really exciting.
So another interesting question came through. Digital therapies and real-world evidence support of it are largely still unexplored. For example, digital vaccines. The industry should get closer to patients. Can you comment on the barriers? Carolyn, do you want to kick us off there? You haven't spoken a while.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I think we've heard a fair amount about how important it is to get closer to patients. Historically, we've been measuring how well a drug works based on claims data, and we're using cost as a proxy for quality. And these are just tremendous limitations for understanding whether, in fact, a treatment actually is effective. And it's also been quite limited in identifying success metrics, if you will. So, well, what does it mean that this drug actually works? Maybe it's related to my activities of daily living. And maybe my ability to perform those activities of daily living are not measured in claims. And we need patient-reported outcomes, or PGHD, patient-generated health data, to help us to measure it. And then we, on the tech side, need to be prepared. Adrian spoke earlier about just how messy real-world data is. It's a reflection of our everyday lives, after all, and we're messy. So our ability to, in a reliable, consistent way, ingest these data from disparate sources and maybe keep the data in its raw format so that we understand what data are missing, we understand where there are imperfections, and then we have methodology and algorithms that then tap into that data in an appropriate way and recognize that different data sources have different nuances. And that's why, for our platform, as an example, trying to meet the data where they are, so that when you think about measuring what impact a medication has on a specific patient's life, we're able to look more holistically at what those outcomes are and what matters most to them. And that applies to digital vaccines or digital medicines and therapeutics as much as anything else.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I can add just a little bit in terms of approach. I think a lot of the reasons that we haven't seen this being successful is there tends to be an approach that is disease first. Vindel sort of mentioned that. And the human is I'm a person first, I might be sick second, third, and fourth. But that's the issue. So when they're building these things, they're speaking of them in a way that nobody else would outside of healthcare. What the idea of like, lose some weight, do some exercise, see you in 3 months. When you look outside and sort of the mass consumer markets, nobody would risk offending one of their consumers when they're buying single dollar items. And yet in healthcare, that's sort of the approach. And I think that's the biggest issue that you have when you're thinking about this. You really do have to bring me along with a digital vaccine. You have to make sure that the product shapes my behavior and brands the goodness over time so that I will actually change behavior, as opposed to sort of this patriarchal medical thing where it's like, the doctor told me to do this, of course I'm going to do this. And what's so interesting about that is it's never worked before. And so we're still using exactly the same methodologies, and we just have to shift our thinking. We have to get much smarter about the consumer and how we speak to them, because behavior change is hard, but getting branding to eventually shift behaviors isn't hard. We've done that for years.
Yeah, and I think that, oh, sorry, Rachel. Yeah, I think that, one of those aspects, just building on what Mickey was saying, it's just that the element of we probably stick to what we know is a good thing to say in terms of medical practice and patient care and sometimes drug development as well. And, you know, just building on actually one of your points earlier, Rachel, you know, I think COVID has actually changed that a lot. I think that, you know, we've seen elements that or innovations that have been around for several years in terms of digital therapeutics, digital health applications, decentralized trials, those types of aspects that really never gained any traction because of our sort of traditional way of thinking of how we approach medical care, drug development, or aspects more related to that. And you know, the pandemic has really changed that a lot, and will be really interesting to see once we get past the pandemic, how much of it sticks, right? I actually feel very confident that quite a lot of it will stick because of the innovation that we've seen over this period of time. But I do feel that, you know, in relation to the question, it sort of takes a seismic shift to move in a direction that we are not used to doing. And I almost see the shift that's been caused by the pandemic and the acceleration of innovation has been one of those areas that will move that in the future.
I hope so. And, you know, I'm in communications, and it's just so interesting to me how bad of a job healthcare companies do about communicating to the public. You know, it's like they take these healthcare technologies and force them onto the public, and they just don't understand them. And, you know, healthcare companies all speak in their own jargon and language as if consumers are supposed to understand what all this means, right? So, I mean, it means I'll have a job. So we've got a bunch of questions. Historically, beyond safety, the FDA supported real-world evidence studies in serious conditions. What TAs do you see as having the greatest potential in the next years to see approvals based more on efficacy shown in real-world evidence studies? And I have to be honest, I don't know what TAs are in this question. So whoever answers it, please define TAs.
Yeah, I can really start on that one. So TA is therapeutic areas, basically. So, you know, what therapeutic areas do we see it? And so the questions obviously come from someone from industry. We know that you know, I think, and clearly, you know, where we've seen the biggest movement from specifically from FDA and EMA is where real-world evidence has been used to support registrational decision making for rare diseases, really in rare disease with high unmet medical needs, where potentially no treatment already exists. And you know, I think that if we consider what a rare disease is, many cancers are also rare diseases because they're driven by mutations. So we've also seen a lot of movement in how real-world evidence is being used in development of oncology programs, for instance, for external controls as a comparator, if not for regulatory decision, but then more broadly for reimbursement. So, you know, I think that clearly rare diseases and oncology are the focuses for the time being. I think the challenge is that in the broader therapeutic areas that are much more prevalent in terms of disease, like cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease, where the expectation is that you have these very large trials which are run to determine the efficacy of a product. I think that those will probably remain, but I also feel that real-world evidence in those settings probably will play more of a role on potentially label expansions or new indications, you know, beyond the first indication. So definitely oncology and rare diseases are the big area of focus, but I do see potential for the future in all the therapeutic areas.
Yeah, we're
So
absolutely seeing additional therapeutic areas be brought into the fold. So certainly oncology, rare disease is where there was a lot of receptivity. And I think the person asking the question also referenced safety studies. So cardiovascular outcomes trial is an example. And, you know, we've been in a multi-year collaboration with FDA and with Harvard Medical School on pressure testing, just how and when is it appropriate to use data to inform regulatory decision-making in cardiometabolic, as an example. As Adrian said, thinking about label expansions, thinking beyond safety to external control arms, immunology as another one, neurology. We are seeing there's an absolute need to look more broadly infectious disease and understand how and when to turn to data. So I think you'll start to see more receptivity. And again, it comes down for us to standards, identifying how and when it's appropriate, and then being completely candid about when it isn't sufficient. We need the randomization of a clinical trial. So let's use a clinical trial to demonstrate that. And if we can focus instead on where it's a no-brainer, because the data are collected routinely, consistently, we understand the endpoints, and we can measure it in a transparent way, let's focus on those areas to really move the industry forward. And I think that can happen across TAs.
I want to just double down maybe on something that Adrian said and maybe do a slight left turn. So I think earlier, Adrian, you were talking about the fact that you need both. You need both to sort of what I would call high quality evidence of randomized controlled trials and also real world evidence. So at the end of the Obama administration, that FDA commissioner, Rob Califf, and a few others published in the New England Journal a whole section on the role of real world evidence. And I think the take home of that, sort of the punchline, is that the future is much broader than the rare diseases and cancer and catastrophic disease, because quite frankly, that's really the test of whether or not whatever therapeutic agent, whatever therapeutic intervention you're talking about delivers value to folks in their real lives. And so if you're in an environment as we are today, where as little as 1 in 4 folks actually have a prescription filled and then do a refill if they have a chronic disease, then you're in a situation where really what matters is what happens to the individual. So it's not so much in that 2-year period did folks adhere to the medications prescribed, did they have sort of the perfect outcome. The question of how easy it is to follow a regimen, the question of other inputs is important. And so from our perspective, as we're thinking about it, it is this meeting of what the science and pathophysiology says, and how does it actually work once you take it out of the lab and put it into people's lives and try to execute on it, which really is one of these concepts of the whole person approach that we're talking about. So I loved your comment earlier where you said that one is not bad, and one is good and one is bad, but much more that there are indications that make sense. And my hope actually is that we have more real world evidence gathering in the broader health ecosystem, other therapeutic areas, but that it's put in the right context when we're looking at that data for the for actions.
Yeah. So Lori, you haven't said anything in a bit, and I have a really big question to ask you, and only 3 minutes left.
No pressure.
No pressure. But obviously, we've got a new administration here in the United States, and I'm curious kind of what are the things that you're keeping an eye on in regards to healthcare policy and potential changes down the road regarding real world evidence?
Yeah, I think it's more generally, it's so exciting to see the new administration take their seats and get going. I do think access is going to be big on the agenda. I think privacy is going to be very big on the agenda. They're still filling, those seats. There's no head of Office of Civil Rights, for example, yet, but it'll happen. And of course, for us, so as just a health policy, junkie, I will be following a lot. I think as it relates to real world evidence, data is king, right? The more data we have, the more opportunity we have to make an impact and drive quality improvement, drive cost reductions, all the things we've spent our careers working on. And so I think that, tracking of the new interoperability rules, which will really help transform the landscape to make data, including the patient-generated health data, the PG, what's the acronym, Mickey? PGHD, more sort of accessible, right? And come in and power all of our RWE capabilities, clinical analytics, AI solutions, you name it. And, that monitoring data, that PGHD, I'm now going to call it, has been a difficult source first to incorporate, and it's really part of this interoperability challenge. So.
Well, thank you, Lori. You answered that question beautifully. I think I would sum up our panel today as saying data is king, trust and transparency at all times. And then when something needs the, full clinical trial, just be honest about that, right? I mean, I guess that they all kind of go together. But thank you so much. I've learned a ton today, from all of you. And I don't think we completely fixed healthcare today, but I think we made a dent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
The opportunity.
Thank you so much to everyone. It was an absolutely fantastic panel. I'm sorry we had to stop it there. I think we could have continued to speak for, if not hours, certainly another good sort of 30, 45 minutes, but we have to stop it somewhere. So thank you to all of the panelists. I certainly learned a lot and, some great insights. I hope you did too. I do encourage everyone to connect with not only the panelists, but everyone else who is participating and attending the event today. That is, after all, why we're here, is to make sort of new connections and grow the life sciences community. So we've now got sort of 15 minutes until our next live panel, Turning Pharma into Digital First Organizations. So I will see you then and have a little break, and I'll see you back here in 15.